Burning Point.
Hello and welcome to the show with me, Katerina Kudashkina. Ebola outbreak appeared to be a major test for the global community in 2014. What is it that has made this particular case so special, and what kind of impact has it produced? The United Nations must learn lessons from the Ebola crisis, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said Monday. He said, and I quote, "We must learn the lessons of Ebola, which go well beyond strengthening public health systems," end quote. So, what kind of lessons should we learn? And again, what kind of impact has this outbreak produced? And this is something we're discussing with Koffi Kouakou, senior lecturer and Africa analyst at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, very clearly there are many layers of impact, but what I see is it's got three elements to it. I look at the geopolitical consequences, the economic or geoeconomic consequences, and the social impacts. I think that's how I would categorize them. And in the social impact, I'll put the idea that health systems have not worked really well and so forth. But these are the three layers where I would put them. Most importantly, if we start with the geopolitical impact, it's that for some reason, suddenly we would find that let's start with the regional response to this when we talk about geopolitical impact. Africans, for some reason, haven't been as quick as most of the time they have been because of the nature of the politics among themselves. You got 54 African countries. There are all sort of skirmishes and priorities among themselves. And for some strange reason, it seems like somebody else from outside has always to remind Africans that, something wrong is going on in the old neighborhood. Or sometimes Africans themselves do not have the strength to tell their own stories and to share with the world the kind of work they're doing to deal with the problems quickly. And we say that in strategy there are four basic reactions and a combination of the four. Those behaviors are being first active, proactive, passive, and then reactive, or the combination of the four, which makes it six. For the most part, there is an impression that Africans are very reactive to what happens to the continent, and there are a lot of evidence for that. But what is also important is that it's shown that in terms of governance, our health system governance and securities haven't responded very fast enough to the kind of health security crises we're facing, including the Ebola or the HIV virus and so forth. So we need to take, when I say we, I'm talking about African leaders, and myself included living on the continent, we need to take some responsibilities in doing what's, in fact, we've been working on this at the Wits School of Governance called anticipatory governance. We shouldn't be waiting for crises to break out. We should, in fact, attempt to preempt them, to do something before they even happen, and in fact, that they don't happen at all. So we need to take that responsibility. The other one on the geopolitical side of it is that Africans still haven't managed to really fend off international, mainly, if you want, Western-dominated interventions in their affairs. And that's going to take time for Africans to be able to sort of defend against this, because every time there's something that happens, Western nations are usually or seemingly the first to jump in to provide aids, interventions, or some kind of band-aids with Geldof and Bono singing up and down. So this is something that Africans haven't been able to really fend off, although I have to say some of it is not really as bad as we might think, because some people have very genuine intention to help. Unfortunately, right beneath that genuine ability to help, there are other agendas that are creeping up and then taking over in the long run. And so that's the geopolitical consequences that I see. The other one is geoeconomic, or the economic consequences of this crisis. It's going to cost a lot of money and also a great deal of governance and leadership to continuously anticipate these crises, but most important, as they happen, to deal with them very quickly, having health systems that work, that helped Africans to defend themselves from the kind of diseases or crises that we're still going to face. And it's not yet done because there may be other crises that will break out. They don't have to be only health. There could be other social issues. There could be war. There could be terrorism. We don't know yet. So this is a consequence to take into account.
We're discussing the impact of the Ebola outbreak with our guest speaker, Koffi Kouakou, senior lecturer at Wits University, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Burning Point.
So the third layer, which is a social consequence or impact, is that the fact that suddenly Africans who were used to socially coming together, very quickly hugging each other, now afraid of hugging somebody else. And then there's this intolerance about, somebody who is, there's a stigma first of saying that, those three countries, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and perhaps, Mali, where there were a few cases, and then, of course, Senegal, now going to be pariahs of people around the world or in Africa looking at them. We've seen right across the continent now some kind of intolerance, African government, and also international governments passing laws about forbidding people from these countries to go to visit them. So socially, it creates some kind of fragmentation. There's no cohesion much anymore because of the fear factor that if you met with these people coming from these countries, you'll have the Ebola virus or you'll be killed. So that fear is really important, and that fear drives that social consequences both regionally and internationally. These are some of the things that I could see, but it doesn't mean that this fear, in fact, that part of the fear is now bringing a lot of Africans together. The African Union has put a fund together. The African Union has been really driving some kind of communication to sensitize and generate a campaign of solidarity to really deal with that kind of fear. So in short, these are the three layers that I would see as an answer to your question.
What kind of agenda are we talking about, and how has it been revealed in this particular case?
Well, this one simple example, which hasn't been really analyzed a lot by many people, is that the sort of fear factor and then the idea that the Ebola outbreak crisis has to be dealt with has now been turned into, there are many ways to turn that into. The first one is that the World Health Organization has declared the Ebola outbreak as a global health crisis, and an emergency has been put out, which means it becomes suddenly a very important tool and platform by some other nations to use it to sort of move into these countries. One simple example is that of the United States. And the United States have cleverly done so, and justifiably so, because the Ebola virus and the crisis has also become a security issue. So the U.S., the United States, has now created using that as a form of new militarization and internal security matter for intervention, a soft intervention in Liberia, and then move in some troops. Instead of moving mainly medical doctors and people who will deal with it, the U.S. has done what I call a double-header intervention, soft intervention, by first making it a military case. So there is now a case for the Ebola virus as a military issue, and that dimension has been transformed into sending more than 4,000 troops rapidly into Liberia very softly, and that hasn't been really discussed at all. And of course, it's not only Liberia that's the United States that's sending that, also China. China has moved in some troops as well, but much less than the United States, also with doctors. So that case is very powerful. It's not just also China and the United States, but the European Union as well, mainly on looking at the security agenda, seeing the Ebola virus as a security, if you want, threat. So dealing with that threat becomes a military, if you want, priority. Thus, sending military troops in that region is really an important, if you want, military strategic element. But at the same time, that military strategic interest links with what many have called now the growing interest in the what's called the Gulf of Guinea, which is rich in resources and oil, for the United States to tap into and to use it as an opportunity to defend its potential interests in the coming future.
We're discussing the impact of the Ebola outbreak with our guest speaker Koffi Kouakou, senior lecturer at Wits University, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Burning Point.
Sir, but have they ever tried to formally explain the bringing of the troops, not only of doctors and medical personnel? Did they give any reason to that? Why the troops?
Well, the only and most powerful way to explain that is to say we need to deal with that security threat because the Ebola virus represents, and based on World Health Organization have put out as a global health emergency, like the SARS virus in Asia, that is a serious security threat. And any security threat component has to have military response to it, at least for the United States. And we know that for the most part, that everything's got to be militarized. And of course, the military-industrial complex can't wait to find arguments to really use most of these tools. And this is one of them. And it's a powerful argument that is so powerful that even President Obama, many times during this year, in some major speeches, is saying that this is a military issue, it's a defense and security issue, and there are no better group, no better people than the military to deal with it. And that's the only argument, but also most powerful, that also almost sort of comes to help in large part. When I say help, it's sort of find a solution for African countries that are a little bit slow at responding, and making it so that the government of Liberia couldn't, it's what I called a military offer to the crisis of the Ebola virus that the Liberian government couldn't refuse. And they've accepted that without noticing that now they're going to have military troops that are there. That'll take another 10 to 15, if not 20 years to leave. In fact, as the military stays there, so do they add all sorts of other priorities onto that military. And in that Ebola crisis fighting, it will be another thing also, okay, we need to build your airports. We need to build your health systems. We need to build your education system. We need to build your transport system and infrastructure. And that's how it escalates. And I can bet my analysis that the U.S. military will be in Liberia for probably 15 to 30 years coming.
And it's interesting that though this development came quite unpublicized, but it's still, I suppose it was this particular development which gave rise to all kinds of rumors and suspicions about this particular outbreak of Ebola. And they were also people experts who posted their analysis on the internet. One of their points was that the Americans have brought in a large amount of Ebola vaccine to Africa, to certain locations, sometime before the outbreak occurred. Is it mere speculation, or do you think that perhaps that could have any ground, though I know it's sense of some kind of, conspiracy theory?
Well, there's a very interesting word today when we know that in the old days when the CIA came out with the notion of conspiracy theory, it's really grounded it now so that anything that seems really far-fetched or sound like far-fetched is really difficult for people to believe. And the best propaganda is to make sure that things are really far-fetched. But the point to this is, we don't really know. Even those who are giving the genesis of the outbreak in West Africa are still puzzled by the fact that suddenly a virus we've known about in Central Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, will appear, suddenly in West Africa, and then with a very virulent strain spread very quickly from Guinea all the way to Sierra Leone and killing close to about 7,000 people. And so far, there is no clear statistics, no exact statistics on the number of deaths. There are speculation that there may be 2 or 3 times more people dead because nobody has gone, door to door in all those villages to find out exactly the number of people who are dead. And so we don't know that much. However, those speculations are now, having some traction. People are very uncomfortable with the fact that, it took such a virulent virus for the U.S. and the European Union to start helping these countries to whom the World Bank and the IMF, lately I'm sure you've heard about this, is now denying that they've forced these countries for some kind of structural adjustment, economic structural adjustment, to cut their health budget And then with the war that we've seen the past 15 years over in West Africa and Sierra Leone, Liberia, now that the war has sort of gone down with the destruction of these health infrastructures, there's really no response or quick response or better response to these kind of, if you want, virus outbreaks. So who knows? We can't really tell, but the speculations are very strong.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker was Koffi Kouakou, Senior Lecturer at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance.
It will be a decision which could only be taken once.
There's no argument over the choice between peace and war.
Unconfirmed reports about Gaddafi being captured.
This morning, I want to talk about the future of Europe.
Burning Point.
Hello and welcome to the second part of our program, in which we are focusing on the impact of Ebola outbreak this year. We're proceeding to discuss the issue with our guest speaker, Koffi Kouakou, Senior Lecturer with Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa.
The first we would see was get a sense of what I call the dismal and lethargic governance responses, both from African leaders and the international community when the outbreak came out. It took them months and months to realize that this was a very serious outbreak. But at the same time, the role of the media, and we know the media is a strategic weapon or also a tool for setting up the agenda, to directing the focus, prioritizing what people think are important to them. So the most powerful countries in the world are using their own media or media by proxy to determine what should be a priority and what's not a priority. But at the same time, what the strength of the media is that is also both an instrument that can really magnetize very small things and making them so big, but also divert the attention away from what really matters. And that the case of the Ebola virus in West Africa has been exactly that. I mean, lately we've seen, during the outbreak, the BBC, for example, has a daily Ebola update. CNN had one. Most of these Western nations had one. So setting up an agenda to remind people of, my goodness, is something really happening there. So it's got dual meaning. I mean, one meaning is this is a very important issue. We need to pay attention. Or let's sensitize people. Let's create a campaign so that we can sort of rally around and find a solution to it. The second one is that it really, if you want, amplifies the weaknesses of Africans and a lot of their leaders in their incapacity to respond quickly. And again, here's the West coming in from wherever it is as a savior to save these poor Africans who are always struggling to deal with their problems. These are the two faces that the media usually does present. But I have to say, it's been really useful to force African leaders to also, quickly deal with their own problems, because for the most part, we find that African leaders are a little bit reactive to their own problems. But we have to say the media has been used for these purposes, and now suddenly, I would say suddenly, quote unquote, because the media has now moved away dealing with the Ukraine situation or now with the Russian economic struggles. If you want, the limelight on the Ebola outbreak has become has gone softer. So people have the feeling that, this issue has now gone down, it's not as important, or people are finding solutions. That's one of the reasons the Ebola outbreak is not in the news anymore. But it's still a huge problem. It hasn't really subsided because the so-called latest numbers and statistics about it have shown that people are still dying. And they're still now going door to door, especially in Sierra Leone or even in Liberia, to find people who are still dying of it. So the outbreak is still serious business there. It's just that the role of the media in both amplifying and then, if you want, reducing or taking away the focus, very, very essential. And this is something many media experts and analysts have looked at it very seriously, how the media can really create traction, but at the same time divert attention for very important issues, very, very importantly, especially in Africa. The most important and the most untold story, and I think the biggest story about the Ebola outbreak in West Africa this year, has been what I call the economics of silence. That is a paradoxical story that asks the question, why hasn't Côte d'Ivoire, which is the bordering country of both Guinea and Liberia, hasn't had any cases of Ebola? Ebola outbreak at all? This is a puzzling question. Or is it underreported by the media? Or has the country really done a great deal to fend off this outbreak by itself or by the help of the international community, the World Health Organization, French or the American CDC or Russia or China helping out? Why hasn't we heard anything at all? It's the most extraordinary paradox and silent. And that's one of the reasons I call it the economics of silence, because there is something there that's quite puzzling. Nothing at all. And the reason why I think it's a story is that the borders between Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, the borders between Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire are very porous. They're the same people going in between. And until today, since the beginning of this year, 2014, we haven't heard any case at all, at least reported by the media or unreported by the media being played out. And I'm just sitting down and said, wow.
Well, but do you happen to have any explanations, tentative explanations to that?
Not at all. I mean, the only explanation I've given is the one I've given above. Either the governance structure, health governance structures in Cote d'Ivoire have managed to really, fend off this crisis in Cote d'Ivoire. Or I won't put it on the side of luck, because today you can't talk much about luck. Most things are done by design, so that the countries managed to, you have Guinea, you have Liberia, you also have the crisis move to Mali, and there were even talks about Burkina Faso. So all these 4 countries circling Cote d'Ivoire, and then suddenly nothing in Cote d'Ivoire. But we know there's a great deal of movement between the population of these 5 countries.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker was Koffi Kouakou, Senior Lecturer at Wits University in Johannesburg.
Burning Point.
And we are taking now a closer look at Ebola outbreak impact on financial markets. And this time our guest speaker is Aleksandrs Rozens, an editor with the Bloomberg Briefs team in New York.
I can speak more to the economic aspect of it, specifically how it played out in the financial markets, and I'll give you kind of an idea of how it works. In financial markets, whether it's Wall Street in New York or Tokyo or even in the Russian equity markets and debt markets, wherever you go, investors can show how they're worried about certain stocks of businesses that can be impacted by a political or natural disasters. In the case of Ebola, what we saw is that there were different ways that the investors reacted to the news, and one way was in share prices. So if a company is publicly traded, its stock will fall if investors feel that the business will see a decline in profit or revenue or income. In this case, the first businesses really to feel a shock from news of Ebola were actually airlines, and it was not just U.S. airlines, it was also European carriers. And to a certain degree, I also checked and saw that Aeroflot, the price of the shares for Aeroflot also fell. We saw the shares of Delta, American Airlines, Southwest fell. British Airways and Air France also saw a decline in share prices. So that was one way that investors expressed their concern about what does Ebola mean for the airlines. And people were thinking, does this mean that airline travel gets cut because of concerns about Ebola? Will people just forego traveling for business and pleasure? The other way that the concerns played out in the financial markets was in debt that companies issue to buy new planes or new equipment, and that those are bonds or notes. And the yield, which goes up when bond prices fall, that yield rose substantially when the Ebola fears were really first being felt. And you can see that in European markets, some of the early stories in European media were showing up in September, and that was already impacting, let's say, credit default swaps or yields, bond yields and equity prices of European carriers like British Air and Air France.
We're discussing economic and financial impact of the recent Ebola outbreak with our guest speaker Aleksandrs Rozens, an editor with the Bloomberg Briefs team in New York.
Burning Point.
The other way that this is showing up is also an unusual market where people gauge volatility in financial markets called the VIX index. And what this VIX index does is it basically measures volatility in credit markets and financial markets broadly. What we saw is that this VIX index, which is actually a financial product that's traded on one of the exchanges, spiked with the increase in coverage of Ebola. So in the first 2 weeks of October, when we saw news of how Ebola there were cases of Ebola in the United States, the concerns about what it means for different businesses and just broadly economic activity showed up in the different corners of the financial markets, and one of them was this VIX index. So when you look at the concerns that investors have, what happens is that you see the decline in equity prices, the share prices. You see the bond yields go up, and you see this VIX index go up. There's another corner of the financial markets where people express concern, and it's called the credit default swaps market. It's basically a place in the market where people can buy insurance against default. So, for example, if I have a 5-year bond that was issued by Air France or British Air, I can buy insurance for 5 years by entering a credit default swap contract, and effectively that insurance protects me against default. Well, what was happening in the latter part of September and early October as the news coverage of Ebola really picks up is the cost of insuring debt for certain businesses really increases. And what you're seeing there is people don't know what's going to happen to some of these airlines. At that point, they didn't have a cushion of low oil prices, and the oil price was much higher than where we are right now, and this was a concern that, what does Ebola do to airline travel? And you're seeing some of this also pick up in some of the hotels and hospitality stocks as well. People were concerned that you'd see a decline in the activity of, travel for business and pleasure. Well, it's kind of interesting. When I saw that you wanted to talk about this topic, I was curious to see where the airline shares were and all the bonds prices and that volatility index. Well, the volatility index has increased again, but it did come down after the concerns about Ebola abated. And that volatility index, that VIX index, is up on concerns about global growth and also specifically concerns about European growth and China's growth, as well as what does a downturn in the oil price mean for a lot of energy businesses. You're seeing that show up in the last couple of days. But airline stocks have actually risen because the fears about Ebola have abated, and the drop in oil prices has helped them tremendously. That's one of the biggest line items for an airline. The bond yields have also come down, so that means the bond prices have risen as the fears about Ebola have abated. So you're seeing some changing in prices the changes in prices that we saw in late September, early October, as the fears about Ebola became more pronounced. Those prices have sort of retreated and come back to normal levels. There was one company that was in trouble because it was a mining company that was in Sierra Leone, which was one of the affected countries in West Africa, and that business was unable to basically raise capital in the credit markets because of the Ebola outbreak. The investors were concerned about what would happen to the mining operations if the Ebola outbreak got worse. And so London Mining had a difficult time raising capital, and it actually entered administration, which is in Great Britain a form of entering a bankruptcy process. So these are the different ways that play out, and we don't know what all this Ebola outbreak means for the economies of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. In the case of Liberia, there's some oil exploration that they're trying to bring about. Sierra Leone has diamonds and bauxite, and Guinea has bauxite as a major mineral resource that it exports. But when it comes to the businesses that we saw impact most immediately, you saw this with the airline stocks, and that's largely because we weren't sure what kind of impact there will be on airline travel from the Ebola outbreak.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Aleksandrs Rozens, an editor with the Bloomberg Briefs team in New York. And now we end this edition of Burning Point, brought to you by me, Ekaterina Kudoshkina. Thank you so much for staying with us. Goodbye and take care.